Class and status in Korean history. Social status during Joseon Dynasty.
In this next portion of the lecture, we will examine how social status was organized in the next dynasty, during the Joseon Dynasty, and how there were certain changes that occurred as a result of the adaptation of Confucian ideology as official state ideology.
What is the meaning of this mask?
The structure of Joseon society was that obviously the king is at the top, but the aristocracy or the Yangban, these were the elite. And the Yangban were the civil and military officials. Yangban literally means both sides, and this is to refer to the civil officials and the military officials who would line up in the palace and stand in front of the king. After the Yangban were the Chungin. These are the middle people, and they are a secondary status group, meaning that they do not have the same kind of prestige as the Yangban, but they are higher than commoners, so they are in between these two groups, and they do have a certain amount of elite status. Next, we have the commoners who made up the bulk of the population, and then there are the low people. If we look at the middle people briefly, these are individuals who generally lived in the capital, and they were known to be technical specialists. Their status becomes hereditary over time, and they were technical specialists in the way that they were an essential part of the central government, but they were not involved with the more scholarly and erudite Confucian scholarship, but they covered more technical aspects such as law and medicine. The commoners during the Joseon Dynasty made up anywhere between 30 to 50% of the population, depending on which time period we're talking about. And these were the peasants, the merchants, and the artisans. Next, we have the low people. These are slaves, both public and private, and similar to the Goryeo Dynasty, we have public and private slaves, or government slaves, and privately owned slaves. There were entertainers, and there were also shamans that were included in this lowest caste. But let's take a look at the highest social group, the Yangban. These were the bureaucrats and the scholars. So at first they were defined by their positions in the government, but over time, because the Joseon Dynasty lasted for so long, about 500 years, they eventually become a discrete social category. The responsibilities of the Yangban were to study, and to study the Confucian classics, to be self-cultivating. So this is a very essential part of Confucian ideology, that one must study in order to be morally upright and to be a virtuous leader. And they were responsible for holding public office. They were not supposed to engage in other activities such as farming or commerce. But because the Yangban had such high status, they also enjoyed certain privileges, and because of this, they went to great measures to protect their status. In order to do this, they intermarried with each other, and they started implementing sumptuary laws. So for example, if you were a Yangban, your house could be larger. It could have more rooms. It could have a certain tiled roof. You could travel using certain modes of transportation. You could use nicer eating utensils. You could wear certain types of clothing. So commoners and lowborn were restricted from this, but if you were Yangban, you could enjoy these privileges. However, as time progressed and the Yangban population grew, the Yangban themselves started making distinctions within their own class. Some of the privileges the Yangban enjoyed were exemption from military service. They also received stipends from the government for their service as government officials. And they received prebends, which were land that they were given as salary for their service to the state. And there was also something called the protection privilege. So a Yangban family would educate their sons because the sons would have to eventually sit for the civil service examination in order to qualify as being a civil official. But let's say that you don't pass the civil service examination, or you don't pass the highest civil service examination on the first try. You can still get a government position through the protection privilege. And there were a certain number of positions that were reserved for these types of individuals, and they could occupy those positions until they did pass the civil service exam. In theory, the civil service examinations were open to anybody. Anybody could sit for them and to take them. But because they were based on Confucian texts written in classical Chinese, and which requires vast amounts of resources to learn and to prepare, the Yangban began to monopolize the examinations. For example, this is a page from the Confucian Analects. So to be able to read this text takes years of preparation. But not only are you required to read it or to memorize it, but you would have to interpret it, to analyze it. And so it is a task that only the Yangban were prepared or equipped to do, and if you were a commoner, the chances of you being able to prepare for this were slim to none. As a Yangban, you also received salaries and land. So there was rank land that you could receive once you became a civil official, and this allowed you the right to collect rent from that land. And it also allowed you to engage in crop sharing, meaning that you could rent out parts of your land, and there would be a tenant farmer on your land, and then you could share crops with them. But over time, the Yangban were able to expand the amounts of land that they had. There was also something called merit land. And merit land was given to the supporters of the royal household at the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. So those individuals who supported Lee Seung-gi in overturning Goryeo and establishing Joseon, these people were given merit land as a reward, and they could hold this land in perpetuity. Unlike rank land, which was given to government officials, in theory, once you retired, you were supposed to give back that land to the government. But this land, merit land, could be held forever and could be passed down to your descendants. Many of these individuals were based in the capital, in and around the capital, Gyeonggi province, and so they had the best land and had the closest access to the capital. Again, as the Yangban population grew, we see that there is differentiation amongst these Yangban families, and there are a few families that became extremely powerful and accumulated wealth and political power for themselves. So because they were able to gain the highest positions in the government and intermarry with the royal household, they became the most powerful families in the country. The Yangban also began to differentiate amongst themselves by differentiating and making a distinction between primary and secondary wives. So if you are wealthy Yangban, you would have a primary wife, but if you could afford it, you might take on 2, 3, 4 wives in total. And so at the beginning of the dynasty, while there was no distinction and while the children, the offspring of these different wives were not discriminated against, this changes through the course of the dynasty. So at some point, the sons of concubines or the sons of primary wives were discriminated against and were not allowed to sit for the civil service examination. This is actually quite an ingenious way for the Yangban to get rid of their competition, because if you think about it, the Yangban population is growing, so there's an increasing number of people sitting for the civil service exam and competing for a fixed number of government positions. How do you eliminate your competition? You say, if your mother was a secondary wife, you no longer can sit for the civil service exam. Many of these people, sons and daughters of secondary wives, went on to become Jungin, or the middle people. Most of these people lived in the capital and, as I said, were technical specialists. So even though they couldn't sit for the civil service exam, they could sit for the technical exams. So some of these areas that they covered included interpretation. So when foreign envoys arrived in Joseon from Japan or China or from Northeast Asia, they needed interpreters. Or if Joseon sent out embassies to the Ming or the Qing capital, they needed interpreters to accompany them. So the Jungin, the middle people, they fulfilled this role. Many of them also became medical officials, they became legal specialists, they became court painters. So these were their specialized occupations, and they also dominated the technical exams and monopolized these positions. As a result, the Jungin start intermarrying amongst themselves. And in order to preserve this secondary elite status, they would intermarry, a Jungin man would intermarry with a Jungin woman. And they begin to form a kind of collective consciousness because they understand that they're not Yangban, but they're also not just commoners. And they also, since they accompanied these embassies, were involved with travel. They were able to go outside of Joseon and see, for example, the Chinese capital. And because they were not Yangban, they could engage in commerce. So some Jungin were able to accumulate quite a bit of wealth for themselves. In fact, by the end of the Joseon dynasty, some of the wealthiest Koreans were Jungin. When Korea is opened up to the outside world in 1876, and Western thought, technology, ideas, institutions are introduced to Korea, these people, the middle people, are extremely well positioned to take advantage of this intellectual shift and the opportunities, new opportunities that arise. Because Western style education and institutions highly valued the study of law, the study of medicine, the study of business and commerce, these individuals were naturally the ones in Korea who would step into these new roles, and the individuals who would be the recipients of this new kind of education. And so they were open to the Western style education and the new opportunities that it brought to them. By the end of the dynasty, not only do we see this differentiation amongst the Yangban and a few families becoming very powerful, we also see on the other end that there are many Yangban families who fall into poverty. So these are families who had perhaps been caught in factional disputes or excluded from political power. Perhaps they had for several generations been unable to produce an exam passer, so then they would lose their wealth, they would lose their status, they would not receive rank land or the ability to collect rent from lands. And so we do see some Yangban, these are the fallen Yangban, who are reduced to poverty, and some even had to engage in farming. Now, the commoners. These are the peasants, the merchants, and the artisans. But it's really the farmers, the peasants, who were the mainstay of the Joseon dynasty, because the farming was considered to be an extremely respectable occupation. There were also the low people, so slaves, public and private. And there are many unique features to slavery during the Joseon dynasty. It's very different from the antebellum South in the United States. So slaves could own their own property. Slaves could marry across social lines. So we do see examples of a slave marrying a commoner, or a slave, female slave, being taken in as a secondary wife. Sometimes slaves owned other slaves. And there's also a voluntary aspect, because the situation for peasants, for farmers, became difficult as the Joseon dynasty wore on. We see that there are some commoners who lost their land, who could not pay their taxes, and felt that they could not bear the burden, and so they gave themselves over to slaves to pay off their debts, with the understanding that once they paid off their debts, then they would win back or earn back their freedom. Hereditary slavery was banned in 1886 and completely banned during the Kabul reforms in 1894. However, we do have historical evidence that slavery still existed in some pockets through the colonial period. Now, by the time we get to the end of the Joseon dynasty, we see that there are some great socioeconomic changes. A series of poor harvest years and famines, an increasing tax burden on the peasantry, an increasing number of tenant farmers who do not own their land. This all led to increasing discontent amongst the peasants. So while there had always been popular uprisings, occasionally here and there throughout the dynasty, at the end of the dynasty, we see that the popular uprisings are more intense, more frequent, and much larger in scale. So to sum up, in the Joseon dynasty, status is based on a variety of factors, including birth, family, marriage, one's hometown, one's education, one's occupation, one's wealth. There are a variety of factors that go into status and defining one's status in Korea.
These are the keywords for this class. Yangban, Jungyun, popular uprising,